Hello and welcome to this short video. My name is Fabien Littel. I am a postgraduate researcher and PhD student at the University of Southampton. After a 20-year career in various roles in HR, I am now starting to move into academia with a particular interest in moral reasoning at work. So what people think about when they think about what's right, what's wrong in their behavior at work, how they make sense of it and how they act upon it. And to that effect, today I wanted to talk to you in the next few minutes about moral disengagement. Moral disengagement, or how Albert Bandura, who developed the theory and the model, put it, how people do harm and live with themselves. Now we'll come on to what that means exactly, but you might wonder why there are pictures of cigarettes and a researcher or scientist on this first slide. Now, I'd like you to think back a few decades ago when tobacco development was probably at its peak. And think about people researching and developing the tobacco products at the time within the industry. And with the knowledge that was already there at the time that these products were creating harm for people's health. And think about how people then made sense of this, those who were working in those positions of researching, developing and promoting, and how those doing this with that knowledge of health impact made sense of it and managed to live with themselves effectively while performing in this role. So that's what moral disengagement is about. It's the mechanisms that allow people to do that. So it was first developed by Albert Bandura, who was a professor of psychology in Stanford University, and dedicated a lot of his work on the social cognitive theory, which really looks at how social dynamics, social cues come into people's cognitive processes and drive really their behavior and their actions. Within this, Bandura focused on moral agency and on the mechanisms of self-regulation, which enable people to be at peace with themselves, so to speak, get a sense of satisfaction and self-worth. And part of these mechanisms of self-regulation from a moral perspective are a series of safeguards, so to speak, moral red lines in a way which people normally wouldn't cross. What moral disengagement does is looking to disengage with those moral safeguards in order to enable somebody to have a detrimental behavior, to perform a certain action, but still feel happy enough with themselves, feel able to cope, get on, and feel that they are doing the right thing. Now, the early applications in the literature and examples provided by Bandura were around the perpetration of inhumanities. So, for example, the moral justification that came to make it possible for people in war to conduct violent military activities. In this case, it would be justified by the protection of the nation, for example, of national interests, a greater good, so to speak. But also in terms of displacement of responsibility. If you look at the example of the Second World War and Nazi commanders who would argue that they are just following orders and that therefore them having a very detrimental behavior is not of their own making, and that's how they make sense and continue to carry on with it. The table on the right on the screen here shows the different mechanisms of moral disengagement per Bandura, which we'll just look at now in a bit more detail. Especially on this chart, which was taken out of a later article, but which is very much what Bandura was working with from the very beginning of the model, and that focus on three areas within the model. And with the mechanisms of moral disengagement attached to them. So the first one is about the practices themselves, that detrimental behavior, those actions which create harm. And there are mechanisms directly related to those. First, of moral justification, like I mentioned a moment ago. So, for example, considering that what you're doing serves a greater purpose, a greater good, and therefore justifies an action which might be causing harm. Secondly, exonerative comparison. So comparing what you're doing to something that is even worse to make it actually feel acceptable. I'll share an example of that in a moment. And euphemistic labeling. So this is about what you call what you're doing, what you call certain things, and you just using certain words for certain actions or items, which kind of mask that negative effect or that negative impact that they might have. And that all allows people to keep carrying on with those practices. The second focus is around the effects themselves. And that mechanism is around minimizing, ignoring, or misconstruing the consequences of what you're doing. So really making it sound as though the consequences aren't quite as bad as they seem to be, so that, again, you allow yourself to carry on. Now, in between the practices and the effects, there's another couple of mechanisms there at the bottom of the chart, looking at the responsibility in itself of carrying out those practices and creating those effects. Through one of these mechanisms is through displacement, the other through diffusion of responsibility. Displacement of responsibility is basically the example I provided about following orders. If somebody else is making those decisions, it is not my decision, therefore I can't be held responsible, and I'm happy enough to continue to perform this. Diffusion of responsibility is more around the fact that, well, it's not just me, there's a group of us making a decision of acting in a certain way, and therefore I can't be held responsible, and others are comfortable enough, therefore I am comfortable enough to continue with it. And finally, the third area, the third focus there is on the victim themselves. And those two mechanisms around dehumanization, for example, again, looking at really the worst examples and atrocities, looking at genocide, the Holocaust, for example, where the narrative and propaganda was really looking to dehumanize the victims there, which was contributing to, and enabling people to really to perform those atrocities. And finally, the attribution of blame, blaming the victim for what is happening to them. And I'll share an example in a second as well. So that provides a view of those different mechanisms that Bandura developed in the model, and what they are relating to, how they are being deployed effectively. And next here, I wanted to look at it in the corporate world, because there's been some work further along by White et al. And Bandura was involved in this piece of work as well, which was looking to apply those mechanisms of moral disengagement in the corporate world. And what they did was to look at 4 different industries which were generating harm in one way or another, and looked through a lot of corporate communication, especially relating to research, and how to identify whether moral disengagement was deployed with these. And the examples I've got on the screen here are related to the tobacco industry, which again relates back to what I had on that first slide. This research, this paper, looks at the different mechanisms of moral disengagement in the context of the tobacco industry, probably again looking back a little while ago as to when the products were more developed, and when the awareness of the impact of smoking was really growing and was really there. So the first mechanism that I just wanted to use as an example was euphemistic labeling. So calling something using a different name that really mitigates or minimizes the negative impact. What the article shares here is with regards to addictive properties of nicotine in research documents or the documents that were shared by the industry. And we're looking now, and a good few decades ago, the addiction or addictive wasn't used as a term and was instead referenced as pharmacological satisfaction. Similarly, there was already some knowledge about the threat of cancer through smoking, but references to carcinogen properties of smoking weren't called out that way. Rather, they were called specific biological activity. So again, this really minimizes through different language the kind of harm and negative impact of this activity. The second one is around advantageous comparison. So again, this is about finding something to compare what you're doing that is worse, so that you kind of minimize the impact of what you're doing. And in the example of tobacco, there were challenges with the impact of second-hand smoke. Within the industry, research was commissioned to assess the impact of other environmental agents, such as pollution or other types of agents out there which people are exposed to. And the ambition here was to find results of other things other than secondhand smoke, which were more harmful to people, to be able to actually defend secondhand smoke and minimize its impact by saying, well, actually people are exposed to other things which are more harmful to them. And final example is attribution of blame. This is a quote from the paper from one of the reports, which was saying that the choice of number of cigarettes smoked rests with the consumer, and we don't directly influence this decision in either direction. Now, this is really saying that the industry is developing the products, but the industry isn't making the consumer use them or consume them in the way that they do, and therefore any excess in use that is triggering damage is down to the user. It is down to the user to effectively control themselves. So again, that allows people to take a step back a little bit, people who are in the industry, and defend to themselves as well what they are doing. It is similar. There's other research on the arms industry, where people are saying, well, effectively we are manufacturing weapons, but we're not the ones pulling the trigger, and that's how they make sense of it and manage to make it work for themselves. So to finish, I just wanted to really have a quick look at the state of the current research and some of the limitations of that model of moral disengagement as well. Now, since Bandura developed it, there's been a lot of extra research that has been conducted, a lot of it focusing on antecedents and outcomes of moral disengagement. So what is the cause of it? What gets people to use those mechanisms, and what does it then trigger? Obviously, we've talked about some of those consequences just just now, but at an organizational level, it's really important to understand how this could drive unethical behavior, basically drive excessive risks potentially. Through this research, measures have been developed to assess moral disengagement, typically in quantitative studies. And that's kind of one of the limitations, certainly from my perspective, is that most research adopts quantitative approaches. So look to apply measures, as part of set models. Now, what that risks is to ignore some of the complexity, the contextual factors, and also the dynamisms of the phenomena that are related to moral disengagement. Again, where there's a lot of complexity and plenty of things at play, and the focus on quantitative measures might miss some of that. The level of inquiry as well on moral disengagement needs to be looked at. So that's looking at either individual, collective, and organizational areas, and how actually moral disengagement is applied by an individual themselves, or how that is reflected within an entire organization, because obviously the dynamics that will go around this and the consequences may well be different. And one thing I'm particularly interested as well is the fact that in the research so far, there's been a lot of look at individuals, especially people in the forefront of causing harm within organization as well, people really responsible for making those decisions. But I would argue that somebody who is within the organization, who belongs to an industry, may also kind of experience and possibly suffer from some moral challenges, and therefore do they use to a certain degree those moral disengagement mechanisms for themselves. And finally, it's important to also acknowledge that moral disengagement is one aspect of moral reasoning. There's a much wider research on moral reasoning and various ways of looking at it. And therefore, it really should be considered against it when looking at a particular phenomenon or an area specifically. So that's it. It's just a short presentation on moral disengagement and the work of Bandura. Here are the references if you just want to pause and have a look to look back at those papers. And I thank you very much for your time, for listening to this presentation. I hope you found it interesting. Don't hesitate to get in touch with me. You can get in touch directly via my own website, and enter your email address as well, so that you get notified of future posts and of my blog going forward. And also you can connect with me on LinkedIn. So thank you very much once again, and take care.